Well, good afternoon, everyone in America and wherever you are around the world. I say it with great feeling. It is a real honor and a privilege to be invited to give this talk on theosophy and science, which has been a very strong topic in the Theosophical Society ever since its inception. And as always, before a theosophical talk, it's important to start with an invocation. The sacred scriptures of the East invariably open with an invocation such as this one from the Atreya Upanishad associated with the Rig Veda. O thou self-luminous one, remove the veil of ignorance from before me, that I may behold thy light. May I seek day and night to realize what I learn. And in the West, there are also examples of great scientists who sought a spiritual dimension to their inquiries. For example, over the years that the president of the Royal Society, Lord Kelvin, held the chair of natural philosophy at Glasgow, he commenced his lectures every day by leading his students in prayer, supplicating that all our doings may be ordered by thy divine governance. Now, scientists don't do that nowadays, unfortunately. But now let me tell you a story, a true story. Once upon a time in ancient India, a newly wedded couple are pointed out in the sky at night by a Brahmin priest. The brightest star, called Vashishta Arundhati, and it is a pleasant little ceremony and supposed to be quite auspicious. Now, the ancient records in their legends link this star with conjugal happiness. And here is that star, Sirius, the double star. First, the science astronomy bit. Discovered in the middle 1800s by the German Friedrich Bessel, this star is really a double star, meaning that it consists of two separate stars situated so close to each other as to appear as one unit to the naked eye. Moreover, it is also a binary star. That is, the pair revolve around a common center of gravity, and the two stars revolve around each other every 50 years. That's the astronomy bit. Now, what's the theosophy or ancient wisdom bit? How did the ancient priests know Sirius was a double star without the benefit of powerful telescopes? Were they drawing upon some hidden faculty of consciousness to access information unavailable to the physical senses? Now, what about the relationship between theosophy and science? Vashishta was a great sage who lived thousands of years ago, and Arundhati was his wife, and their marriage was a model of its kind in perfect happiness and mutual spiritual existence. Can we see the inner significance of this wonderful Indian legend? For the marital happiness of Vashishta and Arundhati, his wife, was because they found a common center of gravity, a common spiritual center of gravity. Different lives moving in separate orbits, but dedicated to a common purpose. So, in a Theosophy Science talk, we are talking of a true marriage or a dance of theosophy and science, not banging into each other or stepping on each other's toes. So a theosophist without any qualifications in nuclear science telling a physicist that his ideas about atomic nuclei are all wrong would be treading on a scientist's toes. Equally, a biologist with no shred of mystical or inner subjective experience, strutting like a gamecock, telling the whole world that consciousness is purely material processes in the brain and God is a delusion, such a scientist would be treading on all 10 toes of a theosophist, which all means that each discipline has its appropriate boundaries and orbits like two stars, and each is legitimate in its own sphere of influence. They're complementary and not opposed, and their common center of gravity, the third factor or pivot point in their marriage, is the investigation of truth. But each has adopted its own philosophies and methodologies, and both are needed. Truth is not an opinion or a preconceived assumption. So here is the content of my talk today. We have to be very clear why science. What is the role of science in the overriding raison d'etre of the Theosophical Society before we move on to see how science and theosophy have progressed and evolved in the last 150 years? Why science? Well, why was the Theosophical Society founded? And directly from that, why such emphasis on modern exact science? And what do we mean by science? Well, then, is it so surprising to find Master KH saying modern science is our best ally, a well-known saying? But the second part of that saying is not so well known, and I'm sorry to say it needs emphasis. Yet, it is that same science which is made the weapon to break our heads with. So science is both our ally and it's the weapon to break our heads with. And break our heads with means trying to deride the ancient eternal wisdom that the masters through the Theosophical Society have promulgated to us. So compatible bedfellows, our best ally. I will give you some examples from physics and cosmology, and then biology and evolution. Talk about some scientific theosophists, modern currents in theosophy science, and then we must mention strange bedfellows as well. Well, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, cloning, psychedelics are all, in my opinion, the misuse of science in many ways. But then we must shine some light on the path of science and theosophy, which is definitely consciousness research, NDEs, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psychiatry, and education. These are all very promising avenues. The future of theosophy science. And here I'm going to talk of alien life, evidence of cosmo-anthropogenesis. Why was the Theosophical Society founded in the first place? The famous saying from the Mahatma, summarized by Master KH, was that between degrading superstition and still more brutal materialism, the white dove of truth has hardly room where to rest her weary, unwelcome foot. And it's time now for that theosophy should enter the arena. The Theosophical Society was chosen as the cornerstone, the foundation of the future religion of humanity. But the warning is that we would rather perish the Theosophical Society with both its founders than it should become a mere academy of magic and a hall of occultism, which means that the emphasis is on brotherhood as per the first object. The emphasis is not on science primarily or occult science, because only when brotherhood is universally established, then can the unexplained laws in nature and man's latent powers, as per the third object, be safely explored. And when brotherhood is so established, we then put emphasis on science as our best ally. But the best ally of who? And what is our best ally? What does our refer to? We come to the raison d'etre behind the core impulse of the Theosophical Society. The Mahachohan's message filtered down, as I put it, to a level that earnest inquirers can comprehend. So this is directly from the Mahachohan, that the doctrine that we promulgate is the only true one, but we can't just give it out in one great big splurge. It has to be inculcated gradually and enforcing its theories for those who know, with direct inferences deduced and corroborated by the evidence furnished from modern exact science. So this is like putting filters upon the divine light. So the doctrine we promulgate is, of course, the divine truth, but you can't just give out the divine truth in one book for all time. That's like shining a blinding floodlight into the eyes of someone who can't possibly take it. So you have to put filters, so to speak, upon the truth. The filter is censorship, as we are prepared to give, but inculcated gradually, rate of revelation. Give it out too fast and there are problems. And we also have the filter of capacity to understand. There's no point in teaching advanced mathematics to children, for example, and corroborating it with the degree of scientific advancement. And here we find the reason for these filters as expressed in the Zohar, the foundational text for the Kabbalah. And it contains this key passage that when the soul is sent to earth, it must necessarily put on an earthly garment to preserve herself, because if she looked at that divine light, it would injure her. So she needs to put on this earthly garment to preserve herself. So the white dove of truth is to do with, of course, the divine truth. But science is our best ally, trying to unite all of this. Now, what kind of science are we talking about? Master K.H. mentions modern science, and the Mahachohan mentions brutal materialism. So is science the same as materialism? Is materialism the problem? We need to distinguish carefully between matter, materialism, and brutal materialism. So science is a very overarching term. So there is a spectrum of meaning contained in the word science, which comes from scientia, of course, to know. Now, science at the physical, the material level, is the systematic third-person study of the physical world through observation, experimentation, and testing. The framework is materialistic. The methodology is inductive, and that is absolutely right. There is nothing wrong with it. It is materialistic science, not spiritual science, that is enabling us to communicate via Zoom. And we applaud materialistic science. The problem starts when people think that is all there is to it. There is not. So there is the science of qualities, Brian Goodwin of Schumacher College, trying to bridge facts and values, quantities and qualities. It's a refined form of materialism, and the methodology is still inductive from experiment and experience, hypothesis and theory. But then you have the all-embracing science, the first-person perspective of the world, all departments, subjective and objective, not through detachment, but through participation and union. And this you might think of as spiritual ontology. The methodology is deductive. So we have ever-expanding circles. Science, the great science, subsumes this science, subsumes this science and this science. Here we are really concerned with mystical intuition and spiritual ontology. The middle ground, abstract thinking, developmental biology and psychology, the wonderful work of Rupert Sheldrake. I called it Rupert biology. So the grand science, mystical intuition, involves mysticism, religion, and occult science. The middle ground involves developmental biology and psychology. And the inner hardcore science, concrete thinking, which is perfectly fine, works through physics, chemistry, and molecular biology. And all of these have their place. But as Einstein said, of all communities he would want to devote himself to, it is only the community of true seekers, which has very few living members at any one time. And I'm afraid to say it's no exaggeration. That was the great Einstein to Max Born. Now, here is the scientific method as it should be practiced. In physical science, we observe natural phenomena, formulate a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, modify it until theory and experiment agree within experimental error, and then establish a theory based on repeated validation of results. So given this approach of many scientists with a spiritual inclination and within the Theosophical Society, here are the prophecies about science being our best ally, referring to natural science and cosmology. Now, I know this is a bit of a full slide, but on here we have prophecies in the Secret Doctrine about the future course of science. And here, these prophecies are corroborated by scientific discoveries in natural science and cosmology. The first one is the breaking down of materialistic science, which was done in all these wonderful ways, from X-rays, radioactivity, quantum theory, the photoelectric effect, Einstein's theory, all showing that materialistic science, as conceived in the 19th century, has really received a death blow. Then general discoveries in natural science, the divisibility of the atom, shown by the electron, then the proton and other atomic particles, that there is no cessation of motion in nature, which is shown by science. Then the interconvertibility of mass and energy, of course, the famous Einstein equation. the wave motion of living particles, where a particle is regarded as a sort of wave on the quantum ocean. So the wave and the particle are not separate, they're different ways of looking at the same phenomena. The particle is a sort of condensation of the wave within the overall field. The origin and periodicity of cosmos, some corroboration from Hawking, and then also the periodical rebirth of universes, the cyclical pattern of so-called Big Bang followed by Big Crunch. So these are all the fulfilling of key statements made in the Secret Doctrine on natural science and cosmology. On life science and consciousness, the astral body and the or if you like, the etheric body, where Rupert Sheldrake has shown that the morphogenetic field can be regarded as a modern equivalent of the etheric double, and I'm using that word in a very loose sense, that there is a formative field that is behind the form and structure of molding tissues and organisms. And that natural selection is no entity, but a convenient phrase describing the survival of the fittest and the elimination of the unit among organisms. But of itself, natural selection can produce nothing. The real issue is the cause behind it. And one of the most important books, a seminal challenge to this conventional Darwinian theory, is the book or the books by Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson, Forbidden Archaeology and the Hidden History of the Human Race. Then the idea of the Gaia, universal life, which Newton himself said all those years ago, that the earth resembles a great animal, not a machine. Consciousness and mind is the field in which the most research and activity occurs nowadays. Parabrahm is the field of absolute consciousness. And Freeman Dyson, the great physicist, says the universe did not come together by accident. Mind exists in a very real sense. So does Eddington say that the stuff of the world is mind stuff. And so does Nobel laureate Brian Josephson. And of course, so does Rupert Sheldrake. Contrary to the philosophy of materialism, the conscious self can be admitted to have a reality which is not merely derivative from matter. So these are very helpful pointers for a true marriage and a dance between theosophy and science. Let's now talk about developments in theosophy science over all these years, because the TS has attracted the highest caliber of scientists. Leaving aside the question of whether Einstein possessed the secret doctrine, the TS has attracted luminaries such as Crookes, Oliver Lodge, Edison. They were all members of the TS. But I would like to concentrate on the contribution of those scientists whom I had the privilege of knowing personally and for many decades, and all of whom were instrumental in what was or is known as the TRC, the Theosophical Research Center, which was formed in the 1920s, and it worked actively for over 60 years. and it comprised a group of eminent scientists, including a fellow of the Royal Society, Lester Smith. And they met in order to forge links between science and theosophy and investigate whether some of the occult doctrines in the theosophical literature could be supported by modern science. And their declared attitude was the same spirit as that advocated by the founders of the modern theosophical movement, namely that these doctrines should not be taken as authority, but rather investigated with openness. So they covered a vast range of topics, including occult chemistry, the etheric plane, clairvoyance, psychical research, cosmology, geology, and medicine. And here are all their writings. They were meticulously taken down. Note-taking was done with great care and attention. And they are, look, how many of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 large volumes. And sad to say, I think these are just languishing in theosophical libraries all over the world, or in some places. And I've tried to convert some of them to a digital format. But all their discoveries are meticulously recorded, as I said, in the Science Group journal, renamed in 1972 the Research Center Journal. And the consummation of their efforts was Intelligence Came First, a book of composite authorship, edited by Lester Smith and Patrick Milburn. And Lester Smith was awarded the Subarao Medal for that. And as the title implies, the book demonstrates that consciousness is a fact of nature, that intelligence is primal, and that the cosmos is grounded in and pervaded by intelligence. And from such a transformed standpoint, it refutes the traditional scientific theory that preaches the role of dead matter and blind chance, allied to the materialistic notion of consciousness being merely a byproduct of electrochemical molecular activity in the brain. The science group also formed what they referred to as a discrepancy group. A discrepancy group meaning discrepancies between science and the secret doctrine. And you can well imagine how that went down well with some people. I'm not going to dwell on these supposed disagreements, except to mention that one that was so dear to Dr. Hugh Murdoch, reader in astronomy at Sydney University, whom I knew very well, was the whole question of the precession of the equinoxes, the discrepancy between what modern astronomy has discovered and what the secret doctrine says about it. And what irritated the likes of Hugh is that why can't we say that the secret doctrine could well be wrong in such matters of detail? It is no affront to HBB's magnificent work if some details are inaccurate or incorrect. Why try to get round the inaccuracy by saying, oh, well, it's symbolic? There's nothing symbolic about an inaccuracy. So the TRC was ultimately dissolved in the 1980s when it became apparent that the primary impetus was being compromised by a split between those who wanted to maintain the essential characteristics of exploration and research and others who felt that the secret doctrine had the ultimate dictate on all matters. But Lester Smith felt that the emphasis was too much on education and not enough on research, and he believed the torch should be passed to Australia in view of his high regard for Hugh Murdoch and especially Professor Richard Silberstein, whose work on mind and brain was cutting edge and seminal. Now I'm going to show you the Theosophy Science Blavatsky lectures that really stand out, in my opinion. Blavatsky lectures from eminent scientists in the Theosophical Society. Firstly, Bertram Tomes, whose Blavatsky lecture was pretty close to Einstein's formulation of E equals mc squared 17 years earlier. And he showed in his Blavatsky lecture how science was moving towards Blavatsky's contention of the spiritual and not material origin of existence. And there's no conflict between the two disciplines when the conclusions of science are based on facts. Dr. Corona True of London University on the changing outlook in science, pointing out science answers the what, whence, and how, but it does not ask why. Wallace Slater, a great chemical engineer who spoke a lot about theosophy and occult science in relation to atomic structures and nuclear energy. Lester Smith, who I mentioned, of course, his talk on science and the real was an in-depth reappraisal of the relationship between theosophy and modern science, talking of the limitations of science, the genetic code, the whole question of purpose or chance, and theosophy and the world of science. He was not happy in those days about inviting scientists to theosophical lectures because he felt that those scientists would move in orbits that were too far removed from theosophical doctrine, and they would not really be interested in what we had to tell them. So the emphasis was more on us to build the bridge to the scientists rather than to invite the scientists into our fold. But that was a long time ago, of course. And the great Arthur Ellison, thrice president of the Society for Psychical Research in London, who constantly emphasized the indispensable need to think independently and to think critically. And a major irritant for Arthur Ellison was the attitude was, it's in the Secret Doctrine, it must be right without question. And in his Blavatsky lecture, he actually says, I'm not a deep student of Blavatsky in the sense that I seem to be congenitally incapable of taking anyone's word for anything really important. I'm basically a man of science and not a man of faith. If I read something and cannot understand it, then I put it on a mental shelf and await further information. And he quotes Annie Besant dealing with what she calls superphysical researchers, in that to proclaim one person as an infallible authority on the subject, unknown to the proclaimed, is to show fanaticism rather than reason. Studying theosophy, then, does not mean reading all the books written by the earlier founders, uncritically believing everything in them. It means critically reading other books written by thinkers and investigators outside the society and comparing and contrasting the different points of view. In this way, we should come to our own view, which may well be different and certainly better for us than the views of earlier members. Prominent scientists. I mentioned Lester Smith in the Theosophical Society. These are his special contributions to science. And here are his books. And I mentioned Arthur Ellison. His special contribution was the paranormal investigation with carefully controlled experiments. And he developed the faculties within himself. An ounce of experience is worth 1,000 books. And his two famous books are The Reality of the Paranormal and The Science of the Paranormal. A man of enormous humility and warmth, a quality highly in abundance from all, without exception, of these top great scientists. And I knew Arthur for many years and had the honor of chairing a few of his lectures. Peter Leggett was another wonderful friend of mine. He was not a member of the Theosophical Research Center in the formal sense. He was certainly a member of the Theosophical Society and very interested in its researches. A fellow of Trinity College, Vice Chancellor of the University of Surrey, and one of the main inspirers behind the formation of the Scientific and Medical Network, with George Blaker, its founder, who was also a member of the Theosophical Society. Perhaps the most wonderful research, if I can put it that way, the groundbreaking research was done by Stephen Phillips, inspired by Annie Besant and Leadbeater's great book, Occult Chemistry, and a lot more. And inspired by these two pioneering clairvoyant investigators, Stephen's books are the following. And what Stephen has shown, his special contribution, is showing how large portions of occult chemistry have been corroborated by modern particle physics. And far more than that, remote viewing, another word for clairvoyance. The cosmic tetractys, Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, sacred geometry, and superstrings, and a lot more. I think Stephen would have received at least 2 Nobel Prizes if his work were taken seriously. Other scientists in the Theosophical Society were Hugh Murdoch, I mentioned before, the astrophysicist, who was quite forthright in pointing out discrepancies between the Secret Doctrine and modern science. And then Victor Gostin, a professor of geology at Adelaide University. And then Professor Richard Silberstein, who was head of the Department of Physics at Swinburne University in Melbourne. And I recently attended Silberstein's talk on bioelectric fields, where biology and reincarnation intersect. And there he outlined recent findings on the nature of bioelectric fields and their crucial role in developmental biology and health. And this was used as a stepping stone to postulate the role of bioelectric fields as one of the mechanisms mediating the appearance of birthmarks at the site of past life lethal injury. Now, Ian Stevenson did a lot of research on birthmarks in his volumes, The Claimed Memory of Reincarnation. And Silberstein explains the role of bioelectric fields in the modification of fetal and early life brain developments, permitting in turn the recollection of past life first-person memories. Another great scientist in the Theosophical Society was Dr. Timely. His peerless book, Man, God, and the Universe, should always remain at an arm's length of wherever we happen to be sitting. And in it, very much in tune with Ellison's counsel, he warns that the wisdom is a transcendent reality. Wisdom cannot be poured into a mold and preserved and then worshipped as a fetish. Finally, I'd like to mention Professor Peter Stewart, very much involved with the Theosophical Society as well. He was a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society and a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, which is the exact equivalent of the Royal Society of Science. And his special contribution was remote viewing and the extension of consciousness, which is a principal avenue of research for Theosophy science. And I attended a few of his very carefully controlled remote viewing workshops. But while Stephen Phillips, who you're looking at here, is known in really a small specialist circle, Rupert Sheldrake, a member of the TS and the Scientific Medical Network, and a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, and one-time research fellow of the Royal Society, Rupert Sheldrake is world-renowned now. And his work on morphogenesis, morphic resonance, parapsychology, telepathy, and perception has obviously infuriated establishment scientists like Dawkins and Lewis Wolpert. But it's received the highest acclaim from enlightened scientists like Hans-Peter Durr and David Bohm. The idea of goal orientation or teleology of formative fields acting as a model or template presaging the physical form of the extended mind of non-local consciousness, these ideas are very much the province of the mystic and the occultist and veer very much into the domain of science. And like a true scientist, Rupert has devised dozens of experiments, simple experiments, but highly effective experiments to test his theories. So again, we have a closer union of science and theosophical doctrine. All of these modern scientists have, in their different ways, affirmed divinity. Of course, starting with Einstein, Wolfgang Pauli, Sir James Jeans, Arthur Eddington, Max Planck, and Erwin Schrödinger. They've affirmed divinity in no uncertain terms in their own way. So we've dealt with the compatible bedfellow, and now what about the incompatible, the strange bedfellow? I'm sorry to say, we need also to be aware of what's going on without dwelling too much on it. This is the scientific method, but what really happens is this. What actually happens is, with no exaggeration, you make up the theory based on what the funding agency and what the manager wants to be true, and you design the experiment to show that to be the case. You modify the theory if you need to, publish the paper, and defend the theory despite all evidence to the contrary. So science, in my opinion, is losing its purity. It's losing its unquenchable quest for truth. So the spectrum of matter, from matter to materialism, from material development to materialistic outlook, goes something like this. Physical matter, then the science of matter, the development of matter, then comes technology, materialism and scientism, which is the brutal materialism that the Mahatma talks about. So the second half of the 19th century was a period of enormous scientific development, along with an exponential development of industry and engineering, which had a tremendous influence on the material features of human life that most people forgot all other connections. And that material development then led to a materialistic outlook, allegedly derived from the new scientific discoveries, despite the supreme irony that science has demolished materialism, so persuasively argued by the likes of Sir Karl Popper and the Nobel laureate Sir John Eccles in their book, The Self and Its Brain. It is a supreme irony that science, quantum science, of course, has demolished materialism, the very science that it's trying to prop up. And Lester Smith has this definition of a materialist as a person who is so mentally retarded by virtue of willfully refusing, despite all evidence, to admit the possibility of non-local life. So what are the problems that science is creating for us? Artificial intelligence, transhumanism, cloning, and psychedelics, in my opinion. Artificial intelligence is really based on the assumption that mind to brain is the same as hardware to software. So intelligence, whether in the computer or in the brain, is the product, the interaction of matter. But the quantum leap of imagination can never be pre-programmed into artificial intelligence. And a fine example from engineering is that the gas turbine engine was not a more sophisticated version of the reciprocating combustion engine. It was a radical break. This is the combustion engine in your motor car, but the gas turbine engine, the jet engine, is a radical break from the past. There is no AI that can possibly achieve that quantum leap, because AI can only produce more and more of the same. And now I'm very disturbed by the number of so-called YouTube podcasts that I hear that are supposed to have come from Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and Carl Jung, talking about the afterlife and talking about God. And it's pretty obvious they have been completely AI generated and have nothing to do with what these great people said. And of course, they mention Einstein, Hawking, and Jung because they are so well known. So you have a typical YouTube saying, in Einstein's secret drawer, a journalist came and discovered a paper, and Einstein said to him, the world isn't ready to see this, but I'm showing this to you. And yes, there is life after death. And with AI, you see Einstein going to his window and talking. And this is a very somber scenario of using AI to mislead people. Of course, AI has its wonderful uses when used properly. And so science, physical science, when used wisely, will result in the physical release of man. When used unwisely, it can result in his downfall. And in my opinion, we are certainly moving also in the direction of the downfall. What about transhumanism? Now, this is, I mean, I wouldn't put it up if it weren't a major academic paper on technologies to revive the dead and a roadmap, and see the arrogance of this. Here, by year 2600, immortality will surely be attained. But with the help of strong AI. So what about us human beings? Are we mainly AI now? But we are also going to have an immortal soul, and we are also promised all of this. And this, believe you me, is happening by leaps and bounds in science. It's not just one person's crazy idea. There's a lot of money and investment in this sort of thing. And then cloning, which I find quite sickening, to be honest. Dolly the sheep was cloned in 1996. Barbara Streisand's two pooches here were cloned. But now, recently, we heard of scientists making embryos from human skin DNA for the first time by manipulating DNA from the skin and then fertilizing it with sperm. And there is also, there always has to be a benefit to overcome infertility due to old age and allow single-sex couples to have a genetically related child. Well, here you see science just regarding nature as a plaything. There is no feeling for reverence. There is no feeling for life. The whole attitude is we've got science, we can play with nature and do what we like. So without a sense of values, without a sense of morality and ethic, I think we're seeing science the being the very weapon to break our heads with. This has nothing to do with promulgating the ancient wisdom. It is misusing science, in my opinion. And also psychedelics, other than using them for medical purposes. Here is Mona Lisa psychedelically, or I prefer the real Mona Lisa. And psychedelics are supposed to be useful for generating free-flowing divergent ideas, but not for convergent thinking. But I say to you, how can you rush to take the kingdom of heaven by storm? Because what you hear from psychedelics is we accomplished it in 20 minutes by ingesting mescaline or ayahuasca. Well, any physical or artistic skill takes years and lifetimes to perfect. How naive can you be to say that you can sort of achieve enlightenment by taking a drug? I'm not saying you won't extend your consciousness, but I'm not saying that is the same as really being enlightened, which is something completely different. So I think we really need to be very aware of what's going on in the world of science now. Psychedelic research is done in a big way at Oxford University, at Imperial College, and it's all in order to research consciousness, where consciousness is dogmatically regarded as a product of the brain. So enough of the dark side. Let's put some light on the path of science and theosophy. Unfortunately, to my mind, there has not been much theosophy science research in the last 1 or 2 decades. Most of the research comes from scientists outside the Theosophical Society who are very much in touch with the teachings, but they're not really within the Theosophical fold. So there are innumerable diverse science-based organizations, books, and reports alluding to the primacy of consciousness, such as the Galileo Commission of the Scientific and Medical Network, the Institute of Noetic Science, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And I'd like to mention especially the PARI Center, which is a non-profit educational center located in the village of Pari, a beautiful medieval village in the province of Grosseto in Italy, in Tuscany. And it fosters an interdisciplinary approach linking science with the arts and the sacred. And the center was directed by David Peat, who co-authored the book Science, Order, and Creativity with the physicist David Bohm. So inspired by David Bohm, David Peat, wholeness, and the implicate order, this is a true interdisciplinary educational center. Then you have the former Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, now widening its scope as the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, understanding consciousness for a better tomorrow. And in addition to all of this, and this is just a very small selection of sincere, dedicated organizations trying to bridge science and spirituality and really alluding to the primacy of consciousness by whatever name. Innumerable webinars, podcasts, research, psychiatry. When I say psychiatry, psychiatric research, and a lot of education is going on in this field. So the triumph of science is best shown by this diagram produced by Professor Bernard Carr, the cosmic Ouroboros. So science has investigated everything from the largest dimension, that's relativity theory, down to the microscopic, minute quantum theory, from the very large to the very small. And here we are somewhere in the middle. But what is completely missing from this is mind. Now, I'm not saying physicists are mindless, but mind, regarded as a product of matter, has not figured in the triumph of science until recently, when increasing numbers of scientists are now realizing that, as Sir James Jeans put it, as Sir Arthur Eddington put it, and many others, that mind is creeping into mainstream science, not as the product, but as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. So by slow degrees, scientists are coming to put the emphasis first on mind and then on matter. But there is enormous resistance still within the scientific camp for this. Now, what more can Theosophy science do? There is an enormous amount of research. There's a lot of buzz in the media about alien life. Where is it? And the mainstream science is still completely fixated on seeing alien life in purely human terms. So NASA is the ultimate gold standard in this. And their definition of life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. And we can only consider it as the specific features of the one life we know, terran life, terrestrial life. Well, how blinkered is this? It's very arrogant, because a seminal passage in the Secret Doctrine, a seminal teaching in the doctrine, and all the spiritual teachings, is everything in the universe is conscious, endowed with a consciousness of its own kind and on its own plane of perception. And just because we do not perceive signs of life, of consciousness, say in stones, what right have we to say, therefore, no consciousness exists? So science in general, in the mainstream, there are numerous scientists who do not agree with this, but in the vast mainstream, they are still regarding the universe as the product of dead or blind matter. When the occult sciences, the secret doctrine, all the great spiritual teachings say there is no blind or universal law, because esotericism never stops at surface appearances. For the noumenal essences, that's the causative influences, have far more reality than their objective counterparts. The universals are more important than the details. So having said that, what can theosophists do? Well, only a few weeks ago, we were told that there is persuasive evidence that life exists on Mars, but it's only the physical biosignature that they are interested in. And then they want to put American boots on Mars's rocky soil. Well, yes, of course. And whether they do that or not is neither here nor there. But the point I'm making very strongly is, until science can be shown and can see that consciousness is ubiquitous and everything in the universe is conscious, then this frenetic search for alien life is just meaningless, for alien life in human terms. So let's summarize here. Let's look at this whole question of revelation and experience in terms of a tension between science and spirituality. That's been a central issue for the Theosophical Society. The balance is not easy to find, of course. Science works from experience and doubt, and it's down to earth, and logical empiricism is important to it. The occult sciences, up in the stratosphere, deal with the perennial wisdom, revelation, and faith. And with a polarity, the poles are united by a common factor, which is the search for truth. Whether this be in the Theosophical motto, there is no religion higher than truth, or for that matter, in the scientific and medical mission to provide a forum for pursuing truth wherever truth leads. So truth can be revealed, or investigated rather, by revelation, the ancient wisdom tradition, the teaching of the sages, or by experience, the way of science. Another way of looking at the revelation and experience is faith and doubt. They're not mutually cancelling. Both are needed. What we accept on faith and trust must be tested by experience. We talk a lot about evidence-based spirituality. That's fine. But a major proviso is, are we qualified to understand the evidence? Or when evidence is presented, do we, like so many convinced materialists, look the other way? So to conclude with the mandate of the sages of all religions, of all times, that the soul of man is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor has no limits. So science will only come to understand the why, the purpose, and the meaning when it moves from the primacy of matter to the primacy of mind. So my plea is never to conclude, but always to keep exploring and inquiring. That applies as much to theosophists as to scientists. The Secret Doctrine was the benchmark high in the stratosphere, and science has slowly approached it from below underneath. But it is presumptuous now to say that the Secret Doctrine comes first and science lags behind it, because there have been phenomenal advances in science, and both have got to dance together, and both are evolving. So science is our best ally now puts the emphasis on the original meaning of science, derived from scire, to know, to find out. And I hope that science will always bring theosophy now and then down to earth, because theosophy provides the grand picture. The doctrines are in the nature of a big truth. But as the great Paul Brunton said, small minds will always mangle a big truth. So when big truths are reduced to the level of little facts and squabbling, then division ensues. So the best aphrodisiac for a happy union of theosophy and science is to realize that big truths must be explored by theosophists and scientists with a large mentality, and above all, an all-encompassing, large-hearted attitude. And with such an attitude, we may discover not the marriage, but a true betrothal between science and theosophy. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to all of you.